So the next question that comes to mind is, if enumeration can't be prevented, can it be mitigated or reduced in some way? Now, enumeration obviously can't be completely prevented because, due to the nature of networks, hosts and network devices have to talk. They have to use services. So there's going to be some information out there. But what you want to do is reduce it as much as possible so that any information that a hacker could get to won't be of much use to them. Now, you can mitigate enumeration by taking certain steps, and usually those involve configuring the hosts and the network services to be a bit more secure. Host machines can be locked down and securely configured. They can have their configuration files changed. They can use more secure authentication methods, and they can be patched. You only want to have services running on hosts that are only what you need and no more. Also, network services can be locked down and configured securely as well. What you need to look at is changing the default security configuration for any services that are out there running, things like LDAP, SNMP, SMTP, and so forth. Now, as far as hosts go, what we want to do is a few things that will ensure that enumeration is ineffective. First of all, we want to change passwords and security settings from their defaults. We don't want to simply run a box as it was installed. We want to make sure that all the default passwords are changed or set. Keep in mind that in Windows, the guest doesn't have a password set, so we need to set one. And we need to disable the guest account. Those are just two examples. You also want to configure security settings to be a bit more tight. For example, you want to securely configure SMB signing, for example. You also may want to turn off file and printer sharing at the host level. Particularly on Windows boxes, file and printer sharing can turn on a host of other services as well. You might want to eliminate anonymous or permissive shares that anyone can get to or everyone can get to. And obviously patch the operating systems and the applications so that you reduce security issues with them. Now, network services can be locked down using a few different methods as well. First of all, turn off services that you don't need. If you're not running a web service, turn off HTTP services. If you're not using LDAP, turn it off. If your DNS comes from the outside of the network, then you don't need a DNS server running on your internal network. Now, you definitely want to use secure configurations for services, and this might mean using authentication on services that otherwise don't use it. It also might mean tightening down the security configuration files for those services. You want to encrypt services whenever possible. Obviously, you can't encrypt every service because some services really aren't designed for that. DNS, for example, is not designed to be encrypted, but you can secure it. Use strong authentication on network services and shares whenever possible as well. Here are some other things that we can throw at you to mitigate enumeration, at least reduce its effectiveness. First of all, turn off SNMP if you don't need it or you're not running it on your network. Change the default community strings from public and private to more secure strings if you are running SNMP. And also, if you're going to run SNMP, use at least version 3 or higher because there are more security configuration options built in to SNMP version 3. You also want to block ports to unknown hosts. In other words, if you're running something like SNMP, for example, only configure it to communicate with known hosts on your network. Use strong passwords, both on hosts and network services whenever you can. Turn off file and print sharing services in Windows and also in Linux boxes as well. If there's any default services or shares that are running, you need to turn those off unless you absolutely need them. Securing DNS is a biggie. Secure the host files, the zone files, and prevent DNS zone transfers to unknown hosts. Only allow them between the DNS servers that you are aware of that are on your network. Configure SMTP to not allow connections from unknown hosts. In other words, make it so no one can simply telnet to it and send an email message off from that SMTP server. You also can configure the SMTP server to sanitize banner messages and any email information in email headers. It can strip those out by simple configuration methods on your SMTP server, whatever that is. And definitely secure LDAP. And for Windows, this means Active Directory. For Linux, it might mean Open LDAP, or it also might mean the services that Linux could use with Windows, like Samba, or connecting and authenticating using the Active Directory LDAP method. Secure those so that you can have secure LDAP, and that means it won't be running on the default port. That means it will be encrypted and so forth, and use strong authentication mechanisms. If you are using Windows, for example, you don't want to use NTLM v1 or v2, you want to use Kerberos. So there's just some other things you can do to mitigate enumeration. And basically, you want to try to enumerate your own network so you can see what information it's giving up, and that'll tell you what information you need to secure.